Lisa had always been the quiet neighbor, the kind of person who waved politely when she saw you, kept her lawn perfectly trimmed, and never caused any trouble. She lived in a beautiful house on Maple Street in the gated community of Pine Ridge Estates. The neighborhood was everything you'd want in a place to call home. Clean sidewalks, perfectly manicured gardens, and houses that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Every morning at 4:30, Lisa would slip out of her house dressed in workout clothes. She'd get into her black Honda and drive away before most people even thought about waking up. Her husband David would leave for his job at the tech company around 8, driving his blue sedan to the office where he spent his days writing computer code and fixing software problems. The neighbors knew very little about what Lisa did for work. When asked at neighborhood barbecues or community events, she would simply say she worked in fitness training for the government. Most people assumed she taught aerobics classes at some military base or helped desk workers stay in shape. It seemed like a perfectly normal job for someone who was obviously in great physical condition. Lisa never talked about her day when she came home each evening, usually around 7 or 8. She would change clothes, help David make dinner, and they would spend quiet evenings watching movies or reading books. On weekends, they might work in their garden or take walks around the neighborhood. They seemed like the perfect couple living the perfect suburban life. But Lisa's job was far from ordinary. Each morning when she drove through the gates of Naval Base Coronado, she wasn't heading to teach regular fitness classes. She was one of only 12 women in the entire United States military authorized to train Navy SEAL candidates. Her official title was Senior Physical Training Instructor, but the men she trained simply called her the Machine. For 8 years, Lisa had been responsible for turning ordinary sailors into some of the most elite warriors on the planet. She designed workout routines that would break most professional athletes. She ran obstacle courses that made grown men cry. She pushed SEAL candidates to their absolute limits, separating those who had what it took from those who would wash out of the program. The training she supervised wasn't just about physical strength. It was about mental toughness, the ability to function under extreme stress, and the willingness to never give up no matter how impossible things seemed. Every exercise she created had a purpose. Every challenge was designed to prepare these men for real combat situations where their lives and the lives of their teammates would depend on their training. Lisa had earned the respect of every SEAL who had gone through her program. These were men who feared nothing, but they respected her completely. She could outrun most of them, outswim many of them, and definitely outthink all of them when it came to creative ways to test their limits. Her reputation in the SEAL community was legendary, but outside those walls she was just the quiet neighbor who kept to herself. The reason for all this secrecy wasn't just Lisa's preference for privacy. Her work involved classified training methods, and she regularly worked with personnel whose identities were protected for national security reasons. She had signed agreements that prevented her from discussing most aspects of her job. Even David only knew the basic outline of what she did for work. This secret life had worked perfectly for 8 years. Lisa loved her job and took pride in preparing America's finest warriors for the dangers they would face. She also loved coming home to her peaceful neighborhood where she could just be a regular person. The contrast between her intense work life and quiet home life was exactly what she needed. Pine Ridge Estates had always been a peaceful place. The Homeowners Association did a good job maintaining the common areas, organizing community events, and keeping property values high. The neighbors looked out for each other, and crime was practically non-existent. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids could play outside without worry. But things started to change when the HOA board decided they needed better security. There had been a few break-ins in nearby neighborhoods, and some residents were worried about package thefts and vandalism. The board met several times to discuss options, and eventually decided to hire a private security company to patrol the neighborhood. That's when Oakwood Security Services entered the picture. The company was owned by a man named Rick Thompson, who had spent 3 years as a security guard at a shopping mall before starting his own business. Rick presented himself as a former law enforcement officer to the HOA board, though his actual experience was limited to writing parking tickets and telling teenagers to leave the food court. Rick convinced the board that Pine Ridge Estates needed serious protection. He painted a picture of rising crime rates and dangerous criminals targeting upscale neighborhoods. He showed them statistics that made every shadow look suspicious, and every delivery truck seemed like a potential threat. The board was convinced they needed professional security immediately. Oakwood Security promised round-the-clock patrols, incident reports, and what Rick called proactive community protection. The board agreed to a 6-month contract that would cost each homeowner an extra $50 per month in HOA fees. Most residents thought it was money well spent for peace of mind. Rick hired 2 other men to help with the patrols. Danny was a 24-year-old who had been fired from 2 different security jobs for being too aggressive with customers. Kevin was older, in his 40s, and had applied to be a police officer 3 times without success. All 3 men were excited about their new authority in Pine Ridge Estates. The security team took their job very seriously. They bought military-style uniforms from an online store and equipped themselves with flashlights, radios, and notebooks for writing citations. Rick even had magnetic signs made for their cars that said, Pine Ridge Security Patrol in official-looking letters. From the very first day, Lisa noticed something was different about these security guards. She had worked around real law enforcement and military personnel her entire career. She could spot the difference between someone with actual authority and training versus someone who was just playing dress-up. These men were clearly in the second category. The way they walked, the way they talked, and especially the way they tried to project authority told Lisa everything she needed to know. They were wannabes, men who had always dreamed of having real power, but had never earned it. Now they had been given a small taste of authority in a quiet neighborhood, and it was obvious they intended to make the most of it. But Lisa kept these observations to herself. She had no reason to get involved with neighborhood politics or security issues. Her life was complicated enough without adding unnecessary drama. She figured the security guards would settle into their routine and everyone would adjust to the new normal. That assumption would prove to be completely wrong. The first citation appeared on Lisa's door 3 days after Oakwood Security started their patrols. It was a bright yellow piece of paper tucked into her doorframe, written in Rick's messy handwriting. The violation? Her garbage can was sitting 2 feet outside the designated collection area on the curb. Lisa stared at the paper for a moment. She had lived in Pine Ridge Estates for 5 years and had never received a single complaint about anything. Her garbage can was exactly where it had always been, in the same spot where every neighbor put theirs on collection day. She crumpled up the citation and threw it in the recycling bin. 2 days later, another citation appeared. This time it was for having her garden hose visible from the street. According to the HOA rules that Rick was apparently enforcing very strictly, all hoses needed to be stored out of sight when not in use. Lisa had left hers coiled next to her front porch after watering her flowers, just like she had done hundreds of times before. David found the second citation when he came home from work. "This is ridiculous," he said, waving the yellow paper. "Since when do they care about garden hoses? The Johnsons have had their hose lying across their driveway for 2 years. Lisa took the paper and read it carefully. The language was formal and threatening, full of phrases like community standards violation and mandatory compliance required. At the bottom, Rick had signed his name with a flourish and added his title, Chief Security Officer, Pine Ridge Estates. "I think our new security guards are trying to prove they're worth the money," Lisa said. She wasn't particularly worried about the citations, but she was starting to get annoyed. These men were clearly looking for problems where none existed. The next week brought 3 more citations. One for parking her car so that the front bumper extended 6 inches past the edge of her driveway. Another for jogging through the neighborhood at 5 in the morning, which apparently violated a noise ordinance that nobody had ever heard of before. The third citation was for having a package delivered to her front porch instead of bringing it inside immediately. Each citation came with the same threatening language about community standards and compliance. Each one was signed by Rick with his made-up title, and each one was getting more ridiculous than the last. David started taking pictures of their neighbors' houses to document similar violations that weren't being cited. Garden hoses everywhere, cars parked the same way as theirs, packages sitting on porches all day long. It was becoming obvious that Lisa was being singled out for some reason. The harassment escalated during the 3rd week when Lisa encountered Rick face-to-face for the first time. She was coming home from her morning run when she found him standing in her driveway, writing another citation on his clipboard. "Excuse me," Lisa said, walking up to her own front door. "Can I help you with something?" Rick looked up with a smug expression on his face. He was shorter than Lisa by several inches, with a round belly that strained against his security uniform. His badge gleamed in the morning sun and his radio crackled with static. "I'm documenting another violation," Rick said, not bothering to move out of her way. "Your morning running routine is disturbing the peace. Multiple neighbors have complained about noise before 6 a.m. Lisa knew this was completely false. She had been running the same route at the same time for years without a single complaint. Her running shoes were specifically chosen to be as quiet as possible, and she never ran past anyone's bedroom windows. "Which neighbors complained?" Lisa asked calmly. "That's confidential information," Rick replied, puffing out his chest. "But I can tell you that as chief security officer, I take all noise complaints very seriously. I recommend you adjust your exercise schedule to more appropriate hours." The way he said chief security officer made it clear that Rick was very proud of his title. He stood there blocking Lisa's path to her own front door, obviously expecting her to be intimidated by his authority. "I'll consider your recommendation," Lisa said in the same tone she used when dealing with difficult people at work, calm, professional, and completely unimpressed. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get to my job." Rick didn't move. "What kind of work do you do?" he asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You leave very early and come home very late. Some might consider that suspicious behavior in a family neighborhood." Lisa felt a flash of annoyance, but her training kicked in. Never reveal more information than necessary. Never let emotional reactions control your response. Always maintain the tactical advantage. "I work in fitness training," she replied simply. "Government contract work." "Government work, huh?" Rick's tone suggested he didn't believe her. "Must be pretty important if you can't tell your neighbors what you actually do." The implication was clear. Rick thought Lisa was hiding something, and he intended to find out what it was. This wasn't just about HOA violations anymore. This was personal. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment intensified significantly. Rick and his team began timing Lisa's comings and goings. They would position themselves near her house during her morning runs, making notes on their clipboards and talking into their radios loud enough for her to hear. Danny, the youngest security guard, started following Lisa's running route in his patrol car. He would drive slowly behind her for several blocks, his emergency lights flashing, before speeding away. When Lisa mentioned this to David, he immediately installed security cameras around their house. The citations kept coming. Lisa was cited for having her car windows down in her own driveway, for checking her mailbox after dark, for having friends visit on a weeknight. Each violation was more absurd than the last, but Rick wrote them all up with the same serious tone and official language. David decided to attend the next HOA board meeting to file a formal complaint. The meeting was held in the community center conference room, and about 30 residents showed up to discuss various neighborhood issues. When David raised his hand during the open comment period, the board president, Mrs. Williams, recognized him with a smile. "Yes, David, what's on your mind tonight?" "I'd like to file a complaint about our new security service," David said, standing up with a folder full of citations. "My wife has received 11 violations in 3 weeks for things that aren't actually problems. Garden hoses, parking, jogging times. Meanwhile, identical situations throughout the neighborhood are being ignored." Mrs. Williams looked uncomfortable. "Well, David, Mr. Thompson did warn us that there might be an adjustment period as residents get used to proper compliance with HOA rules." "This isn't about adjustment," David replied, his voice rising slightly. "This is harassment. They're following my wife around and citing her for things that every other resident does without any problems." Rick was sitting in the back of the room in his security uniform. He stood up when David finished speaking. "Mrs. Williams, if I may respond," Rick said in his most official voice. "The property in question has been flagged for multiple violations since we began our security assessments. We treat all residents equally, but some properties require more attention than others to maintain community standards." Several board members nodded along with Rick's explanation. Mrs. Williams looked relieved to have what sounded like a reasonable response. "I think Mr. Thompson raises a good point," she said. "Perhaps there have been ongoing issues that the previous security arrangements weren't catching. I'm sure once everything is brought up to standard, the citations will decrease." David realized he wasn't going to get anywhere with the board. They clearly believed Rick's version of events, or at least they didn't want to confront their new security contractor over what seemed like minor complaints. As the meeting ended and people filed out of the conference room, Rick approached David with Danny and Kevin flanking him on either side. "Your wife seems like a nice lady," Rick said with a fake smile, "but she's got an attitude problem when it comes to following rules. That kind of behavior can create real problems in a community like this." The implied threat was unmistakable. David felt his hands clench into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting into a confrontation with these wannabe cops would only make things worse. "We'll continue to follow all legitimate HOA rules," David replied evenly, "just like we always have." "Good," Rick said, his smile never wavering, "because we'll be watching to make sure you do." As David walked to his car, he realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. These men weren't going to stop their harassment, and the HOA board wasn't going to help. He needed to find another solution before things got even worse. What David didn't know was that Lisa had already reached the same conclusion. And unlike her husband, Lisa had resources that Rick Thompson couldn't even imagine. Saturday morning started like any other weekend for Lisa. She woke up early, made coffee, and decided to wash her car in the driveway before the day got too hot. It was a peaceful morning in Pine Ridge Estates. Birds were singing, sprinklers were running on green lawns, and neighbors were starting their weekend routines. Lisa had just finished rinsing the soap off her black Honda when she heard the crunch of gravel behind her. She turned to see the familiar white patrol car pulling into her driveway. Rick got out first, followed by Danny and Kevin. All three men were wearing their matching security uniforms and carrying their clipboards and radios. "Good morning," Lisa said calmly, continuing to coil up her garden hose. She had learned from experience that staying calm and polite was the best way to handle these encounters. "Ma'am, we've received reports of suspicious activity at this address," Rick announced, pulling out his pen like he was conducting a serious police investigation. "We need to ask you some questions." Lisa straightened up and looked at all three men. Rick was trying to project authority by standing with his hands on his hips. Danny was nervously shifting from foot to foot, clearly excited to be part of what he thought was real security work. Kevin stood slightly behind the others, taking notes on his clipboard. "What kind of suspicious activity?" Lisa asked, genuinely curious about what excuse they had come up with this time. "Your frequent absences from the neighborhood," Rick replied seriously. "Multiple residents have expressed concerns about your daily disappearances and your evasive responses about your employment." Lisa almost laughed out loud. These men had turned her normal work schedule into some kind of mystery that needed investigating. She wondered if they had any idea how ridiculous they sounded. "I leave for work every morning and come home every evening," Lisa said patiently, "just like millions of other people who have jobs." "But where exactly do you work?" Rick pressed, stepping closer to Lisa. "And why are you so secretive about it? What kind of government fitness training requires this level of secrecy?" The question revealed that Rick had been asking around about Lisa's job description. He had probably talked to neighbors and tried to piece together information about her daily routine. The fact that she couldn't discuss details about her work had clearly made him more suspicious. "I work on a military base," Lisa replied truthfully. "Many government jobs require security clearances that prevent employees from discussing details about their work." "Security clearance?" Danny spoke up for the first time, his voice cracking slightly with excitement. "What kind of security clearance? What level?" Lisa realized that these men had no idea what security clearances actually meant or how they worked. They had probably seen too many spy movies and thought secret government work was inherently suspicious. "The kind that means I can't discuss details with neighborhood security guards," Lisa said with a slight smile. "I'm sure you understand." Rick's face flushed red at what he perceived as disrespect for his authority. He moved even closer to Lisa, now standing only a few feet away from her. "Ma'am, under HOA regulations, we have the authority to investigate potential security threats to this community," Rick said, his voice getting louder. "Your evasive behavior and suspicious schedule qualify as a legitimate concern." Lisa felt her patience finally starting to wear thin. These men were now claiming that having a job and maintaining professional confidentiality made her a security threat to her own neighborhood. The absurdity of the situation was almost unbelievable. "What exactly are you investigating?" Lisa asked, her tone remaining calm but with a slight edge that anyone with military experience would recognize as a warning sign. "We need to verify your employment," Kevin chimed in, reading from his clipboard. "We need contact information for your supervisor and documentation of your security clearance level." Lisa stared at all three men for a moment. They were actually demanding that she provide classified employment information to a private security company with no legal authority whatsoever. The level of overreach was stunning. "You want me to violate federal security protocols to satisfy your curiosity?" Lisa asked slowly, making sure she understood their request correctly. "We want you to prove you're not a threat to this community," Rick shot back. "Your refusal to cooperate only makes you look more suspicious." That's when Lisa realized these men had crossed a line they didn't even know existed. They weren't just harassing a resident anymore. They were demanding that she compromise national security protocols to appease their inflated sense of authority. "Let me make something very clear," Lisa said, her voice dropping to the tone she used when addressing SEAL candidates who had pushed her too far. "I am not required to provide employment verification to private security guards. I am not required to discuss classified information with unauthorized personnel. And I am definitely not required to justify my daily schedule to anyone in this neighborhood." The change in Lisa's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. Her posture shifted slightly. Her hands moved to a more ready position, and her eyes took on a sharp focus that none of the three men had seen before. She was no longer the polite neighbor trying to avoid conflict. Rick either didn't notice the change or chose to ignore it. His authority had been challenged, and his ego couldn't let that slide. "Ma'am, I'm trying to be reasonable here," Rick said, taking another step forward. "But your attitude is making this situation more difficult than it needs to be. Maybe we need to involve real law enforcement and let them sort this out." The threat was clear. Rick was implying that he would call the police and make false reports about Lisa's behavior if she didn't comply with his demands. It was exactly the kind of abuse of power that Lisa had expected from these men. "Real law enforcement?" Lisa repeated, genuinely interested in Rick's response. "You mean police officers with actual authority and training?" "That's right," Rick said, his confidence growing. "Officers who know how to handle uncooperative residents and potential security threats." Lisa nodded thoughtfully. "That's an interesting idea. You should definitely call real police officers. I'd love to explain to them how private security guards are demanding classified information and threatening residents who won't comply." For the first time since the conversation started, Rick looked uncertain. He had expected Lisa to back down when threatened with police involvement. Instead, she seemed eager for that confrontation. Danny tried to help his boss regain control of the situation. "Look, lady, we're just trying to do our job here. Why can't you just cooperate and answer a few simple questions?" "Because your questions aren't simple," Lisa replied, now looking directly at Danny. "You're asking me to violate federal law to satisfy your curiosity. That's not cooperation. That's you not understanding the limits of your authority." Kevin, who had been writing furiously on his clipboard during the entire conversation, looked up with a confused expression. "What federal law?" The question revealed just how completely out of their depth these men were. They had no idea that demanding classified information from government employees was a serious legal issue. They thought they were just being thorough security guards. "The same laws that would land all three of you in federal prison if you kept pushing this investigation," Lisa said matter-of-factly. "But please don't let me stop you. Make those phone calls. Involve real law enforcement. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your methods." Rick's face was getting redder by the minute. He had started this confrontation expecting to intimidate a difficult resident into compliance. Instead, he was being lectured about federal law by someone who clearly knew more about the subject than he did. "Ma'am, I'm giving you one last chance to cooperate," Rick said, his voice shaking with anger. "Answer our questions or face the consequences." Lisa smiled for the first time since the conversation started. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Mr. Thompson," she said, using Rick's last name for the first time, "I think you're about to learn the difference between someone who pretends to have authority and someone who actually earned it." Before Rick could respond, the sound of a vehicle pulling into the driveway interrupted the confrontation. Lisa looked over Rick's shoulder and smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. "Perfect timing," she said quietly. Rick spun around to see who had arrived, and his face went pale when he saw the black pickup truck with government plates pulling up behind the patrol car. The man getting out of the driver's seat was clearly military, even out of uniform. His bearing, his haircut, and the confident way he moved marked him as someone with real authority and real training. Behind him, two more men emerged from the truck. All three newcomers took in the scene with the kind of quick assessment that comes from years of tactical training. Their eyes moved from the three security guards to Lisa to the overall situation, gathering information and calculating responses in seconds. "Afternoon, Lisa," the first man said casually. "David sent us a message. Said you might need some backup." Rick looked back and forth between Lisa and the new arrivals, clearly trying to figure out what was happening. The confident expression he had worn throughout the confrontation was rapidly disappearing. "Just having a conversation with our neighborhood security team," Lisa replied, her tone now completely relaxed. "They were asking about my job." The military man's eyes shifted to Rick with the kind of attention that made experienced soldiers nervous. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that comes from years of combat leadership. "Is that right?" he said, looking directly at Rick. "And what exactly did they want to know?" Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez stepped out of his black pickup truck and immediately assessed the situation with the kind of tactical awareness that comes from 15 years of military service. 2 bronze stars and a silver star on his dress uniform spoke to combat experience that most people couldn't imagine. Behind him, Petty Officers Martinez and Johnson moved with the same quiet confidence. Rick Thompson suddenly found himself facing 3 men who radiated real authority in a way that made his security guard uniform look like a costume. These weren't wannabes playing soldier. These were the actual warriors that Rick had always dreamed of being, but never had the courage or discipline to become. "Chief Rodriguez," Lisa said with obvious respect and warmth. "Thanks for coming by." The use of Rodriguez's military rank made Rick's stomach drop. Chief Petty Officer was a senior enlisted rank that commanded respect throughout the Navy. Rick had claimed to be a former law enforcement officer to get his security job, but he had never even made it through police academy training. "No problem at all," Rodriguez replied, his eyes never leaving Rick's face. "David said you were having some issues with local security. Something about harassment and intimidation?" The casual way Rodriguez spoke made it clear that this wasn't the first time he had dealt with situations like this. His tone was conversational, but there was an underlying edge that suggested he was very interested in Rick's answer. Danny and Kevin had gone completely silent, standing behind Rick like schoolchildren who suddenly realized they were in serious trouble. The confidence they had shown while bullying Lisa had evaporated the moment real military personnel arrived on the scene. "We were just conducting a routine security investigation," Rick stammered, his voice much less confident than it had been moments earlier. "Standard procedures for addressing resident concerns." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully, then looked at Lisa. "What kind of investigation?" "They wanted to verify my employment and see my security clearance documentation," Lisa explained calmly. "When I declined to provide classified information to unauthorized personnel, they threatened to involve law enforcement." The change in Rodriguez's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. His jaw tightened slightly, and his eyes took on the kind of focus that combat veterans developed when identifying threats. "They asked to see your clearance documentation?" Rodriguez repeated slowly, making sure he had heard correctly. "That's right," Lisa confirmed. "And they demanded contact information for my supervisors." Petty Officer Martinez stepped forward, his own military bearing obvious to anyone with experience. "Sir, did you just ask a cleared government employee to compromise classified information?" The question was directed at Rick, but it was really a statement. Martinez knew exactly what had happened, and he was giving Rick a chance to explain himself before things got much worse. Rick looked around desperately, suddenly realizing that he had stumbled into something far more serious than a neighborhood dispute. "We just wanted to verify her story. She's been evasive about her job and residents have expressed concerns." "What residents?" Johnson asked, speaking for the first time. His voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers to direct questions. "That's confidential," Rick replied weakly, falling back on the same excuse he had used with Lisa earlier. Rodriguez smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Confidential? That's interesting. Because making false reports about government employees with security clearances is a federal crime. So is attempting to coerce classified information from authorized personnel." The blood drained from Rick's face as the legal implications of his actions began to sink in. He had thought he was just being a thorough security guard. He had no idea that his harassment campaign against Lisa could result in federal charges. "Now I'm curious," Rodriguez continued conversationally. What exactly made you think a fitness instructor was suspicious? And what kind of training did you receive that led you to believe demanding classified information was appropriate? Rick opened and closed his mouth several times without making any sound. The confident authority figure, who had been intimidating Lisa minutes earlier, had been replaced by a nervous man who clearly had no idea how to handle the situation he had created. Lisa decided to help clarify things for everyone involved. Chief Rodriguez, perhaps you could explain to these gentlemen exactly what kind of fitness instruction I provide for the Navy. Rodriguez's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. Well, since they're so interested in your job, I suppose there's no harm in explaining the basics. He turned to face Rick directly. Lisa is a senior physical training instructor at Naval Special Warfare Command. She designs and implements conditioning programs for Navy SEAL candidates. The words hit Rick like a physical blow. Navy SEALs were the most elite warriors in the American military. Everyone knew about their legendary training and impossible standards. And Lisa, the quiet neighbor he had been harassing for weeks, was responsible for preparing these warriors for combat. She's one of only 12 women in the entire military authorized to train SEAL candidates. Rodriguez continued, clearly enjoying Rick's reaction. The men she works with consider her a legend. They call her the Machine, because she can break down the strongest candidates and build them back up into elite warriors. Danny made a small whimpering sound. He had been following this woman around in his patrol car, trying to intimidate someone who spent her days training the most dangerous men on the planet. The security clearance you demanded to see, Rodriguez went on, that's classified at a level that most people in the military never even know exists. The training methods she develops are considered sensitive enough that foreign governments would love to get their hands on them. Kevin dropped his clipboard. The implications of what they had been doing were becoming clear even to him. They hadn't just been harassing a neighbor. They had been attempting to compromise national security. Rodriguez stepped closer to Rick, his voice dropping to a tone that carried unmistakable menace. So let me ask you again, Mr. Thompson. What exactly made you think it was appropriate to demand classified information from a Navy SEAL instructor? Rick's mouth moved, but no words came out. Everything he had thought he knew about the situation had been completely wrong. The suspicious neighbor with the secretive job wasn't hiding criminal activity. She was protecting military secrets that were vital to national defense. Lisa watched the confrontation with professional interest. This was exactly the kind of situation she dealt with regularly in her work. Men who thought they were tough discovering what real toughness actually looked like. The difference was that SEAL candidates volunteered for the experience and knew what they were getting into. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Rick finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Really? Rodriguez replied. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like 3 civilians with no legal authority have been harassing a government employee and attempting to compromise classified information. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a federal crime. Martinez pulled out his cell phone. Should I contact base security, Chief? They'll want to know about this attempted breach. The mention of base security made Rick's legs weak. Naval base security didn't mess around when it came to protecting classified information, and the people who handled it, they had real authority, real training, and real consequences for people who threatened national security. Please, Rick said, his voice cracking. We didn't know. We were just trying to do our job. Your job, Johnson repeated flatly. Which is what exactly? Because last time I checked, private security guards don't have the authority to investigate government employees or demand classified information. Lisa decided it was time to end Rick's suffering. Gentlemen, I think Mr. Thompson and his team have learned their lesson. Perhaps we can resolve this without involving base security. Rodriguez looked at Lisa with the respect that came from years of working together. Are you sure? Because what they've done here is serious enough to warrant federal investigation. I'm sure, Lisa replied calmly, as long as they understand that this harassment ends immediately and permanently. Rick nodded frantically, grateful for any chance to avoid federal prosecution. Yes, absolutely. No more citations, no more investigations, no more contact whatsoever. Good, Rodriguez said, his tone suggesting that Rick had made a wise choice. Because if we hear that you've bothered Lisa again, or any other military families in this neighborhood, we won't be nearly as understanding. The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone Rodriguez had used throughout the encounter. which somehow made it more intimidating than if he had shouted. Rick understood that he was being given one chance to walk away from the situation without facing serious consequences. "We understand completely," Rick said quickly. "This was all a terrible mistake." "Yes, it was," Lisa agreed. "A mistake that won't be repeated." Rodriguez and his men spent a few more minutes talking with Lisa about work schedules and mutual friends, completely ignoring the 3 security guards who stood nearby, looking like they wanted to disappear. The casual conversation made it clear that Lisa was part of a community that Rick could never understand or access. When the military personnel finally left, Rick and his team were alone with Lisa again. But the dynamic had completely changed. The woman they had been trying to intimidate for weeks had been revealed as someone far more formidable than any of them had imagined. "I think we're done here," Lisa said simply. Rick nodded and hurried back to his patrol car, followed by Danny and Kevin. As they drove away, Rick realized that his career as chief security officer of Pine Ridge Estates was probably over. Word of this encounter would spread throughout the neighborhood within hours. Lisa watched them leave, then went back to finishing her car wash. She had work to do on Monday, and Navy SEAL candidates didn't train themselves. By Sunday evening, every resident in Pine Ridge Estates had heard some version of what happened in Lisa's driveway. The story spread like wildfire through neighborhood group chats, coffee conversations, and backyard fence discussions. David's security cameras had captured the entire confrontation, and the footage was making rounds on social media platforms. The video showed everything. Rick and his team arriving with their clipboards and fake authority. Lisa calmly explaining that she couldn't discuss classified work details. The 3 security guards becoming increasingly aggressive and demanding information they had no right to request. Then the arrival of real military personnel and the complete transformation of the situation. Mrs. Williams, the HOA board president, received 17 phone calls on Sunday alone. Residents who had initially supported hiring Oakwood Security were now horrified to learn that their security guards had been harassing a Navy SEAL instructor. The woman who quietly lived on Maple Street wasn't just any government employee. She was training America's most elite warriors. By Monday morning, Mrs. Williams was sitting in her living room with the other 4 board members, trying to figure out how to handle the crisis. The legal implications alone were staggering. Their hired security company had attempted to coerce classified information from a government employee with a high-level security clearance. "We need to terminate the contract immediately," said board member Tom Chen, an attorney who understood the seriousness of the situation. "What they did could expose the HOA to federal liability. We're lucky if Lisa doesn't sue us for allowing this harassment to continue." Board member Patricia Murphy nodded in agreement. "I've already received calls from 3 reporters asking about the incident. This is becoming a public relations nightmare." The emergency board meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, they had voted unanimously to terminate Oakwood Security's contract effective immediately. They also voted to issue a formal apology to Lisa and David, along with a refund of all HOA fees charged for security services. Mrs. Williams had the unpleasant task of calling Rick Thompson to inform him that his services were no longer needed. The conversation was brief and awkward, with Rick claiming that the whole situation had been blown out of proportion. "We were just doing our job," Rick protested when Mrs. Williams explained the board's decision. "How were we supposed to know she worked for the Navy SEALs?" "By not harassing residents and demanding classified information," Mrs. Williams replied curtly before hanging up. The story was already gaining traction beyond Pine Ridge Estates. A local news station picked up the story after seeing the viral video online. The segment aired on Tuesday evening with the headline, "HOA Security Guards Harass Navy SEAL Trainer." The reporter interviewed several neighbors who described weeks of escalating harassment and inappropriate behavior by the security team. Rick Thompson found himself unemployed and facing potential legal consequences. Several residents had filed complaints with local police about harassment and intimidation. David had provided authorities with weeks of documented evidence showing a pattern of targeting Lisa for violations that other residents routinely committed without consequence. The legal troubles were just beginning. The Navy's Internal Security Division opened an investigation into the attempted breach of classified information protocols. While Lisa hadn't revealed any actual secrets, the attempt to coerce such information from a cleared employee was taken very seriously by military authorities. Danny and Kevin, Rick's two assistants, found themselves looking for new jobs as well. Word of their involvement in harassing a military family spread quickly through the private security industry. Few companies wanted to hire guards who had demonstrated such poor judgment and lack of professionalism. The broader story resonated with people far beyond the local community. Social media was filled with comments from current and former military personnel, expressing outrage at the treatment Lisa had received. Veterans shared their own stories about being questioned or harassed by people who had no understanding of military culture or security protocols. Lisa returned to work on Monday morning as if nothing had happened. She arrived at Naval Base Coronado at her usual time and began preparing for another day of training SEAL candidates. The men she worked with had heard about the incident through military channels and were both amused and impressed by how she had handled the situation. "I heard you had some trouble with wannabe cops," said one SEAL candidate. "During a break between training exercises, nothing I couldn't handle," Lisa replied with a smile. Though it was nice to have Chief Rodriguez and the others stop by, the candidate grinned. "I bet those security guards never saw real operators before. Must have been educational for them." The incident had actually strengthened Lisa's reputation within the military community. Word spread quickly about how she had remained calm and professional while being harassed, never revealing classified information despite pressure and threats. It was exactly the kind of integrity and discipline that the military valued most. At home, Lisa and David were dealing with an unexpected consequence of the story going public. They were receiving messages of support from neighbors, friends, and complete strangers who had seen the news coverage. Many were from military families who had experienced similar harassment due to the secretive nature of their work. "I had no idea you dealt with anything like this," said their neighbor Janet, who stopped by with a casserole and an apology. "I'm so sorry we didn't speak up sooner. We just thought Rick was being thorough." Lisa appreciated the support, but she was more interested in getting back to her normal routine. The attention was nice, but she preferred the quiet anonymity that had allowed her to separate her intense work life from her peaceful home life. The Pine Ridge Estates board was working hard to repair the damage to the community's reputation. They implemented new policies requiring background checks and proper training for any security personnel hired in the future. They also established clear guidelines about resident privacy and the limits of HOA authority. Most importantly, they sent a formal letter to every resident explaining what had happened and apologizing for allowing the harassment to continue. The letter made it clear that Lisa had done nothing wrong, and that the security company had exceeded its authority in investigating residents' employment. The story continued to spread through military communities across the country. Lisa became something of a folk hero among military spouses who had dealt with similar questioning and suspicion about their family's work. Her calm, professional response to harassment was seen as a model for how to handle such situations. Rick Thompson eventually moved away from the area, unable to find work in security, and tired of being recognized as the man who had harassed a Navy SEAL trainer. His dream of being a respected authority figure had turned into a nightmare of public humiliation and legal troubles. The incident also led to changes in how private security companies trained their employees. Several firms began including specific instruction about respecting residents' privacy and understanding the limits of security authority. The story of what happened in Pine Ridge Estates became a cautionary tale in security training programs. For Lisa, life gradually returned to normal. The media attention faded, the neighborhood settled back into its quiet routine, and she continued her important work training the next generation of Navy SEALs. The incident had reminded everyone involved about the difference between real authority and fake authority, between genuine service and playing dress-up. Most residents of Pine Ridge Estates learned a valuable lesson about making assumptions and respecting their neighbors' privacy. They realized that the quiet woman on Maple Street, who had always seemed so ordinary, was actually doing extraordinary work in service of her country. The story became a reminder that heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they live quietly among us, doing vital work that they can't discuss, serving their country in ways that most people never see or understand. And sometimes, when pushed too far by people who mistake bullying for authority, those heroes reveal exactly who they really are. Lisa continued to wake up early every morning, drive to Naval Base Coronado, and prepare America's finest warriors for the challenges they would face. She came home each evening to her peaceful neighborhood, where she was now treated with the respect she had always deserved but had never demanded. The harassment was over. The wannabe cops had learned their lesson, and Lisa went back to doing what she did best, training Navy SEALs and living quietly among neighbors who finally understood that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who never need to prove how tough they are.